Okay, kids. We need 4 more students here before we get to the really critical stuff to make a quorum. No, we're all right. So look, today is the Pentagon Papers case. Now this is truly one of the greatest judicial combats in all of American history. This is the caliber and importance of the case in and of itself, puts it in the top probably 6 or 7 cases ever decided by the Supreme Court. But the drama that was involved in this, that you could see, you could feel it in the kind of comments that were being made by the justices about how harried they felt, how much under pressure they felt, the sensationalism that was all involved, about the lawyers working nonstop without any sleep, all of which is true, which I'm going to tell you about today. And as I'd mentioned to you before, it is the only case in the entire history of the United States Supreme Court, which, as you know, only has 9 justices. It's the only case in history that has 10 written opinions. And so this is an extraordinary case because it arose relating to an extraordinary period in the lives of the baby boom generation, the 60s generation, the idealist generation that is referred to in many different ways. But the largest and best educated generation in the entire history of our human family, actually, the baby boom generation. And so it all relates to the Vietnam War. And it's interesting because for you guys, the Vietnam War must be something like the Civil War. It was a thing, you've heard about it in history, you've read some stuff about it, but the only thing that you know about it up to this point in time today is the kind of things that have been published. Worse yet, the kind of things that are taught in schools, which is very limited indeed. For example, of the students here, how many of you have studied the Vietnam War in any of your courses? Okay, you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. Okay, now it's going to be an interesting inquiry here. Let's raise your hands again, the folks who've studied it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, now let me ask you this. What do you think the cause of the Vietnam War was? Any one of you, based on having studied it?
It was the worry about the spread of communism.
Ah, there's one.
Industrial military complex.
Doing what?
Needing a place to focus its wartime efforts in the Cold War, because just staying put with all those military resources couldn't have been a good thing, especially because they had such a ginormous budget. Their budget at the time, defense spending, basically outspent the rest of the world, and they weren't involved in real wars.
Okay, had to have a war to go to in order to generate the kind of funding. Correct?
The French were our allies and we owed them.
The French were our allies and we owed them. Okay, what else, Matt?
So broadly, it was about expanding executive powers.
That the war itself was fought for the purpose of expanding executive power. That's interesting. What else? There's another couple of you that still, yeah, Corey.
It was essentially one of the last true investments of attempting to have colonial power or imperial power. And as the guy in the pink shirt noted, the military-industrial complex had a big factor, especially in the Gulf of Tonkin, how we essentially did everything in our power to ensure we entered the Vietnam War.
Okay. So let me. I'm interested in the opinions that you have. Now, of the folks who haven't studied it in any of your courses, do you guys have any kind of a different opinion about what the war in Vietnam was all about? Of the students here, no opinion at all about what it's about because you haven't studied it in school? Is that what it is? If you
Yeah.
My understanding is that the war, at least from the point of the view of the vets, was to help the people who had lived there be able to build the skills to come out from the reign of communism.
There it is. That's the old one. If you hadn't had class, that's what you come up with, is that it was basically to the Americans coming in to help the poor South Vietnamese get out from under the yoke of communism. Right? That's a good one. Okay. You're going to take a second try at it.
You could claim that it was containment, and George Kennan kept corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. But then again, later in his career, Kennan, if you research it, will tell you that he was against most of his later uses of that corollary.
All right.
I was gonna say it was kind of an ongoing Cold War with Russia and kind of fighting through like other countries.
A proxy war. Okay. Okay. So let me tell you now what we got here. Now I'd mentioned to you before that I was at Harvard College and had Henry Kissinger for Gov 180 and same course that Dan Ellsberg had with Kissinger. He obviously developed a somewhat more friendly relationship with Kissinger than I did as a result of his student days. But what you're really dealing with here, in having studied this and done a junior tutorial in this particular thing back at the time, back in 1966, what you have here is back in 1861, back when we were very right even before the American Civil War, and before it was all during the major push in the United States when you had a lot of pressure being put on to expand westward. 1849, you had the big gold rush in California. You had the treaties of 1854, 1851, 1858, taking major chunks of land away from the Native American people, pursuant to this whole concept of a manifest destiny. This whole idea that the white people in the world had this kind of obligation to try to bring civilization to the quote colored people, which non-white around the world. And in the context of this type of activity that was going on, and before the United States really started exporting that type of ambition outside of North America, that they were confining themselves pretty much to North America, it was later on in the 1880s and 1890s that they began to go into Mexico, go down into Mexico to try to take part of Mexico away in the Mexican-American War, and then Cuba and the Philippines, et cetera, in the 1890s. But 30 years earlier, France in Europe, in 1861, actually sent a major war vessel into the harbor in Saigon, over in Vietnam, back in 1861, and they went ashore, and it was clear that France was attempting to stay in the competition for colonial influence and stuff in different parts of the world. But they went ashore, and the sailors, the French sailors, went into the shopping area, this market area in Saigon. And though history is not very clear about what happened, you got a pretty good idea what happened with French sailors. But the bottom line is that a fight broke out between the French sailors and some of the people in the market, the people in Saigon. And what happened is the French sailors retreated from the fight and went and got back on the rowboats and went back out to the big frigate that was in the harbor, and they fired on the city as a result of this skirmish that took place, this fight. And they smashed the city with their powerful armaments on this frigate, and then they didn't know what to do because they had basically seized Saigon. And so they were trying to figure out how back in 1861 how they could get any kind of communications back to France to ask them what it is they should do. And so the captain of that particular vessel decided that what he would do is seize and hold the city. And that is how the French basically ended up stumbling on into Vietnam. And the reality of it is, between 1861 and 1940, the 80 years that the French maintained a colony in Vietnam, they never did in a single year end up breaking even with regard to any particular products that they happened to have gotten their hands on during that period of time. But in 1940, in September of 1940, the Japanese Imperial Army, while it was questing and conquering around Southeast Asia, went into Vietnam. The Japanese army, not China, not Russia, but Japan, went into Vietnam, into the peninsula, and basically drove the French out, attacked the French soldiers in garrison and drove them out. The French retreated, and in 1945, after the dropping of the bombs, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki on August 6th and 9th of 1945, the French decided that they were going to go back in. And this whole effort, the French sent military troops, figuring that Japan was on its back at this point in time, and so they sent troops into Vietnam to try to recapture their colony. And it turns out that there were Japanese soldiers that were still fighting back at the time, and the French sent out a radio call, a distress call, which was picked up by the 5th U.S. Army Air Force in the Pacific, and they actually put planes into the air to go attempt to come to the aid of the French that were attempting to retake their colony. And Franklin Roosevelt actually received word that the 5th U.S. Army Air Force was in the air on its way to help the French, and he sent a direct order ordering them to stand down, and allowed the French to be defeated, actually, in that attempt to retake the colony. And that's the principal reason that Charles de Gaulle, developed this kind of deep and abiding hostility toward the United States for having failed to come to their aid to retake their colony. But after Roosevelt died, when Franklin Roosevelt died on the 12th of April of 1945, and Truman came to office, the forces surrounded him and persuaded him to allow the French to go back in. And so when Japan actually fell completely, Truman put the forces in to assist them, called the U.S. Army Air Force to assist them, and they went back in and they retook the colony. And from 1945, actually early 1946, from that period all the way up to 1954, that whole 9-year period, the indigenous people in Vietnam, under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, rose up against the French and engaged in a revolutionary war to try to oust the French, who had been occupying their country for 80 years, and 90 years by that time. And Ho Chi Minh and the other forces were constantly gaining advantage over the French until 1954. And at a place called Dien Bien Phu, in 1954, a general under Ho Chi Minh by the name of Ngo Dinh Diep actually surrounded the entire fortress at Dien Bien Phu with the French in it. And they actually disassembled the mortars and carried them on their back and climbed up the mountains all the way around the fortress there, the encampment at Dien Bien Phu, and they reassembled the mortars at the top of the mountains and just stormed down death on the French for a solid week and a half, just decimating the forces there. And the French asked for surrender, at which point the Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh agreed to go to Geneva and hold a peace conference. And they agreed to allow the French to evacuate, the remaining forces to evacuate from Dien Bien Phu and to withdraw below a particular line parallel in Vietnam. But they were absolutely emphatic that under no circumstances would they agree to allow the French out of there. They would destroy them unless it was clearly agreed that nobody was going to try to make that any kind of a boundary line. And everyone agreed that was there. The United States was there at the Geneva Conference in 1954. And there was a specific agreement that the French signed agreeing to withdraw their forces and to allow an election to be held in Vietnam, a popular election, to determine what the government of Vietnam would be. And when that withdrawal took place and the election was in process of being organized, it became clear to the Eisenhower-Nixon administration that in fact the forces of Ho Chi Minh and the indigenous forces were going to win the popular election overwhelmingly. And so the Eisenhower administration, Richard Nixon, chairing the 54-12 committee, in charge of the National Security Council's covert operations, began covert operations in Vietnam to try to stop the election, and they did. And so the election, parts of the election took place, but they tried to mobilize people to not participate, to boycott the election, etc. But it was absolutely clear to everyone that the popular forces in Vietnam were going to win this election. And so what the Eisenhower-Nixon administration did in 1955, after the elections were held, they got a young fellow by the name of Ngo Dinh Diem, who was actually a graduate student at Columbia University in New York City. And they flew him and his family into Saigon, and they set him up as a complete puppet regime and provided U.S. military advisors to him and began a campaign of trying to pretend that there was a separate government in the southern portion of Vietnam, and they claimed all of the territory up to that line of parallel where there was a specific agreement that there would be no such effort ever made. And so the United States began sending in military advisors from 1955 all the way up to 1960. And when Kennedy was elected in November of 1960, he determined, and Bobby, his brother, who was a lot more than just the Attorney General in the new administration, determined that this was a place where the United States could show its stuff. And they put special emphasis on the Green Berets, the Special Forces, and the Central Intelligence Agency covert operations. And they began a major campaign and substantially ramped up the efforts that had been going on through the Eisenhower and Nixon administration, and began to take a stand there trying to show that the United States was going to prevail. And this entire operation went on until November of 1963. The real turning point in this whole thing was the October, well, let's back up a bit. As you know, when Kennedy was elected in November of 1960, he came to office January 21st of 1961, and in April there was a planned invasion. Richard Nixon, as the head of covert operations for the CIA and the National Security Council, had planned an invasion of Cuba. This is the Cuban, the whole Bay of Pigs invasion. There was a plan to have an invasion where they were going to send in a handful of Cuban exiles, the CIA, and they were going to land on the beach at the Bay of Pigs, and they were going to send up a radio signal saying, "The fish is red, the fish is red." And at that point, Richard Nixon, who had planned to be president as of that time, was going to send in U.S. military forces that were going to be kept on ships off the coast of Cuba. And he was going to send in the United States Marines to back this group, recognizing that group, that cadre on the beach at the Bay of Pigs, as the new government of Cuba. And what happened is that they got annihilated on the beach primarily because the air cover that the CIA was going to be sending in for them, which was based in Nicaragua, was actually on a different time zone. And so what happened is that they sent the air cover and it arrived an hour late. And so the forces at the Bay of Pigs got creamed. Their 2 boats that had all their military equipment and ammunition and stuff got sunk, and they got trapped on the beach. And they were all arrested by the Cuban government. And Kennedy was basically embarrassed because Kennedy, when they came in, when John and Bobby came in January, they were briefed in detail about this plan, but the Kennedy brothers refused to allow U.S. military forces to be deployed. They were saying, look, if the CIA is correct and this small cadre of Cuban exiles goes ashore and they announce a free Cuban government, and if they're correct that the people of Cuba feel imprisoned on that imprisoned island, that they will rise up and throw off the yoke of communist government. That was their position. But it's important to point out that both Ho Chi Minh in Vietnam and Fidel Castro in Raul Castro, at the time they undertook their revolutionary activity, both of them wanted to have alliances with the United States. They wanted to have alliances with the United States. They wanted to have a democratic government. But the United States, under Nixon's tutelage mainly in the National Security Council, they took the position that unless both of them refused to have any diplomatic relations with Russia and China, that the United States would declare them to be enemies of the United States. Because neither one of them would relinquish the right to have diplomatic relations with anybody they wanted to, the Nixon operation inside the National Security Council basically decided to make war upon both of them and to declare them to be enemies of the United States. Now, that's what was going on at this particular point. Now, of course, the people in the United States didn't know that, because the Eisenhower-Nixon administration was just saying that the communists in Vietnam were attempting to overthrow a young democratic government in the southern part of Vietnam, and that there was a communist revolution that had taken place in Cuba and had seized Cuba and putting it under the yoke of communist tyranny. And so that this was the understanding that people had from reading the major press that was being basically promoted and flogged by the administration at the time. This all was going on until October of 1962, when there was this another event, which to you is just history, but to some of us, we lived through this thing. It was the Cuban Missile Crisis in October of 1962, in which, because after the Bay of Pigs had failed in April of 1961, Kennedy, embarrassed by the involvement of the United States in this, publicly apologized to Khrushchev and to the people of Cuba for having been involved in supporting this, apologized and promised publicly that the United States would stop all covert operations attempting to overthrow the government in Cuba. But in fact, it was a big fat lie. The Kennedy administration, all they did is they changed the name of the covert operation from Operation 40 to Operation Mongoose, and continued the whole operation, being run out of the University of Miami at the largest CIA station outside of Langley in the world, at a place called JM Wave. And they called in a new young fellow to run this thing. His name is Theodore Shackley, who was the deputy to Reinhard Gehlen, the former Nazi commander of anti-Soviet intelligence for the Third Reich. This young fellow, an American citizen, was the deputy to Galen, in that he was taken and brought back to the United States and made the station chief of the CIA in Miami and put in charge of supervising Operation Mongoose to try to overthrow and destabilize the government of Cuba. And so there was a complete violation of his public promise on the part of Kennedy. And when Khrushchev and the Soviets realized that Kennedy and the administration was still engaged in this operation, despite their promises to the contrary, the Soviet Union began to smuggle missiles into Cuba. And they established missile batteries in the island of Cuba, which were able to, they were in the process of finalizing them, that would be able to reach the United States. They would not only be able to reach Miami and all of Florida, they'd be able to reach to Washington, D.C., the entire southern coast of the United States, and they were in the process of bringing in larger ones that could reach Washington and Chicago. And so in October of 1962, President Kennedy announced a blockade against Cuba and surrounded it with U.S. naval vessels, and told the Soviet Union that if they didn't stop trying to bring missiles into Cuba, any ship that tried to cross the blockade with any offensive nuclear missiles, it would be, the United States would consider that an act of war on the part of the Soviet Union. And on the night of October, I think it was 16th to 17th, of 1962, one of those ships did in fact cross the barricade, the blockade, and the entire Joint Chiefs of Staff of the United States military went into session and voted unanimously to have the United States go to first strike against the Soviet Union. And when Kenny O'Donnell came to Kennedy and told him that the Joint Chiefs had voted to do this, under the whip hand, actually, of the head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the U.S. Air Force general, was pushing like mad for this to be done, and they voted unanimously to actually launch a first strike nuclear attack against the Soviet Union, with full knowledge that the Soviet Union would retaliate, and several million American citizens at a minimum would have been killed, and more likely it would have gone to a full-scale nuclear exchange between the Soviet Union and the United States, and that probably you wouldn't be here, nor would I. And so that particular night is an absolutely historic night that is not remembered well in history because of the suppression of the information about the fact that the Joint Chiefs had voted to go to nuclear first strike. And Kennedy, when told about this, according to Kenny O'Donnell, said, "I will not be the man who does this." And it was that night that marked the watershed in the Kennedy administration. And Kennedy resolved at that point that he was going to back away from this type of nuclear confrontation. He sent communiques to Khrushchev recommending that they begin negotiations on a nuclear disarmament and to start disarming the United States and the Soviet Union from nuclear missiles, because they had come right to the brink of total, absolute Holocaust. Okay? And so this is the turning point where Kennedy decided that he was going to, he made a famous speech at George Washington University, where he announced that he was going to be doing this. And he then he announced that he was going to start withdrawing U.S. military forces from Vietnam. And all of this took place in October, November, December of 1962. And he then began his campaign in the beginning of 1963. In the beginning of 1963, he realized that he was going to have to be campaigning for 1964 for the re-election. And so he started then choreographing his public speeches to communicate to the people that this new era was going to be coming about, where the United States was going to take an aggressive position to disarm nuclearly. He reached out to Khrushchev, he reached out to Castro to open a back channel to communicate with Castro, to carry on negotiations, looking toward potentially recognizing the government of Cuba. All of this was going on, and he ordered the dismantling of 5 covert paramilitary bases that had been established by the Central Intelligence Agency along the southeastern part of the United States. There was one at No Name Key, one at a place called Swan Island. There was another one in the Everglades, and there were 2 more by Lake Pontchartrain in Louisiana. We'll get into more details about that when we discuss the Kennedy assassination. But he gave the orders that those bases were to be shut down and that no more activity was to be undertaken to try to mount any type of paramilitary action against Cuba after the Cuban Missile Crisis. And in February of 1963, the forces on Swan Island that were under the command of a fellow named Frank Sturgis mounted a military assault against the island of Cuba. And President Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy sent in 6 helicopter gunships with U.S. Marshals, fully armed with M16s, and burnt them out and arrested them for violating the Neutrality Act. Figuring that was going to be sufficient, they released them. But later, early in the next month, in March, a second operation was mounted, this one out of the base in the Everglades. And we'll go into more details about this next week. But that operation was under the control of a man by the name of E. Howard Hunt, a CIA officer that was coordinating that base. And the Kennedy brothers then sent in a second wave of helicopter gunships and burnt that place out and arrested those guys and charged them with violating the Neutrality Act and held them in custody. So all of these activities were going on at this time, and so that this Vietnam War, when Kennedy was assassinated in November of 1963, and Lyndon Johnson came into power, one of the first things that Lyndon Johnson did was reversed the orders of Kennedy about withdrawing troops from Vietnam, and Johnson doubled down on the Vietnam War. And if you want to read an extraordinarily interesting book about the Kennedy administration with regard to the Vietnam War, probably the best one that I would recommend is a book called The Best and the Brightest. It's a book by David Halberstrom. It's extraordinarily a great book looking at the inside of the administration of Kennedy and how people that were so smart and so well educated could have gone so wrong in what they were doing. But when Johnson came into office in November, on November 22nd of 1963, he withdrew the orders of Kennedy and he doubled down on the Vietnam War, and he was looking for a way to convince the American people that they ought to support the doubling down on this Vietnam War. And that was what generated on August 4th of 1964, some 6-7 months actually into the Johnson administration, an incident called the Gulf of Tonkin. And this was an event that was reported by the Johnson administration to the American people as having been an unprovoked attack on an innocent U.S. vessel, the USS Maddox, off the coast of Vietnam. It was asserted that the Maddox was in international waters, minding its own business, and that it was attacked, unprovoked attack by the torpedo boats of the Vietnamese. And the USS Maddox, quote, returned fire on them, and the Johnson administration went immediately to Congress, citing that as an act of war against the United States, asking for a resolution on the part of both houses of Congress to authorize him to send in some 50,000 United States military forces into Vietnam to protect American interests in that area. Now, all of that sets the background for what we're going to be talking about in some detail today, because I was, as I told you before, as time went on, in 1968, Nixon gets elected when Johnson, I went over that with you, how Johnson withdrew in January of 1968 when the mounting opposition to the war was reaching a major crescendo. And Senator Eugene McCarthy was recruited by the anti-Vietnam War forces to run against Johnson for the Democratic nomination, and came within just a handful of votes of beating Johnson in the first primary in New Hampshire in January of 1968. Johnson withdrew, and Bobby Kennedy came in to run for the Democratic nomination, and was going to win the nomination, had won the California primary the night before he was assassinated. And there was this major turmoil that I reviewed for you in the first session when we were together, about the turmoil that was surrounding this entire period of time, 1968, 1970, 1971. And I've reviewed some of the cases that I was directly involved in during that period of time, in 68 and 69 and 70. And the last one that we discussed was the case of In re Pappas, which was joined together with another Black Panther case of Caldwell, in that we went to the United States Supreme Court and we're in the process of briefing the United States Supreme Court on the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. This brought us into June of 1971. I was down at the Cahill Gordon law firm at that time, and I was working on the amicus briefs, as I told you, for the Washington Post and for the New York Times and for CBS and ABC, and we were working on the primary briefs for NBC, getting ready to argue before the United States Supreme Court. In that context, I had a substantial number of contacts with James Goodell. James Goodell was the chief counsel for the New York Times, and since I was doing these amicus briefs, I used to have regular communications with him, trying to figure out what the spread of positions were that we were going to be taking on behalf of the different members of the media about these rights, whether we were going to take an absolute position that there could be absolutely no infringement of the First Amendment, and so therefore the journalists didn't even have to appear in front of a grand jury, taking the position that was taken in the Caldwell case, for example, by Tony Amsterdam, or whether there should be a balancing test, what kind of burden should be put on the prosecutors who wanted to drag a journalist in front of the grand jury. We reviewed that in our last session on Tuesday. So I was in the process of having these meetings with James Goodell and having these discussions, and on the morning of June 3rd, Thursday morning, June 3rd of 1971, about 7 o'clock in the morning, I was in the office at Cahill, being the only bachelor in the firm of 178 trial lawyers, which they viewed as a sign of instability on my part. That I was there working on these briefs, and Jim Goodell called. And he said, Danny, he says, this is Jim Goodell, I've got to see you. I see you're in the office bright and early. He said, can you get a hold of Floyd? Can you get a hold of Floyd Abrams and get him in here so I can come over and meet with you guys? Something has come up. And I said, I can do that. So at about 7:15 or so on June 3rd of 71, I called over to Gene Shyman, who was my compadre of the Sheehan and Shyman combination at the Cahill firm. And I said to Gene, would you give Floyd a call? And so he did. He called Floyd and got a hold of Floyd about 7:30 in the morning on June 3rd of 71. And we talked to Floyd and I told him that something had come up. I didn't know what it was yet, but Jim Goodell had called and wanted to meet with us and wanted to get Floyd saddled up and get him to come on over. And I wanted Gene to come too. So Gene and Floyd showed up a little after 8 o'clock, about 8:15 in the morning. Now I know all of this because I was the one that ended up writing the history of the Pentagon Papers case for the law firm, the major law firm. I was put in charge of writing the history because I was involved in every single meeting and every single decision that was made. And so Floyd and Gene come on over at about 8:15, and Floyd was saying, "What is this? What is this? You got Thursday morning, you got me over here at 8:15 in the morning, 8:30. What's going on?" I said, "I don't know. I just know that Goodell called and wanted to have a meeting. It was important. Wanted to have you here. I thought it was important to have Gene here." So the three of us were in Floyd's office, and about 8:45, Goodell arrives. And he comes up, they showed him upstairs. We left word at the front desk that he would be coming. He shows up, he comes into the meeting. We're in Floyd's office, okay? And here's Floyd sitting over behind his big power desk over here. And I'm sitting over on this side of the room, and Gene Shyman is sitting over here. And in comes Goodell. Goodell's like a big 6'4" guy. And he comes in, and he kind of shuffles around, he sits down in his chair over here, and he starts chit-chatting. "Oh, isn't it great weather? Isn't it nice? Aren't the walls straight up and down today?" And I was sitting there, and after about like 3 minutes of this, I said, "Jim, what's the story? You just called us, got Floyd out of bed, not me out of bed, I was here working, but got Floyd out of bed, to get him to come on over here, what's going on?" And he says, "Look," and he gets up and he goes over and he closes the door. He goes over and he sits down and he says, "One of our reporters, Neil Sheehan," he said, "has been given 47 volumes of top secret classified study conducted, ordered by Bob McNamara to do an entire analysis of the internal decision-making process that led to the Vietnam War and the escalation of the war. It's got all the cable traffic, it's got the private internal memoranda, it's got all the classified discussions that went on." He said, "This is an absolute bombshell." He said, "And the problem is that Lord Day and Lord, who are our lawyers, who, as I mentioned to you, were getting in less and less favor now with the New York Times because they had declined to support the right of journalists to protect their confidential news sources. And so they were quite growingly unhappy with them, more and more happy with us because of the aggressive position we were taking with regard to the First Amendment and journalist rights. So he came to us and told us that Lord Day and Lord, actually their senior partners, the two senior partners at Lord Day and Lord, had taken the position that Louis Loeb and Herb Brownell took the position that if the Times didn't give back the papers, that the Lord Day and Lord firm was going to turn them in to the FBI. Now, that wasn't viewed as aggressive defense work. But it turns out that Herb Brownell was one of the three best friends in the world of Richard Nixon, the senior partner at Lord Day and Lord. In fact, had been the Attorney General in the Eisenhower administration. In fact, is the guy who drafted up all of the standards for classified information for the Eisenhower administration. And in fact, had been the principal author of Section 793 of the Espionage Act. And so both Brownell and Loeb both insisted that the Times give the papers back, because Jim Goodell used to be a lawyer at the Lord Day law firm before he came over to become legal counsel for the New York Times. So it was quite natural. He brought the question to them, asking for an official opinion letter, and they told him that it was criminal for them to continue to retain the documents, and it would be a criminal violation of the Espionage Act if they published these. So Goodell's sitting there in the chair, and he says, and here's Floyd, kind of just completely like a deer in the headlights, sitting behind the desk over there, going, "Oh no, what is this?" And so I said, "This is great," I said. I said, this is great. You got the papers? He said, yes. He said, what do you recommend we do with them? And I said, and Floyd was going like this, and I said, print them. You print them, and you print them right on the front page. Put them right on the front page, big banner headline. How big a banner headline do you have? Put them right there and publish these things. And Floyd looked up and he said, wait, he said, wait a second, that's not an opinion of the firm. That's not an opinion of the firm. And so Jim Goodell kind of turns his chair over and he looks at me and he kind of slides his chair, actually literally slid his chair over toward me. And he said, really? He says, what do you think they'll do? What do you think they'll do if we start publishing these? And I said, well, I said, knowing Nixon and old meathead Mitchell, his attorney general, I said, they'll probably threaten to prosecute you or something. And he said, really? Prosecute us for what? And I said, probably espionage. Espionage, he says, and he starts crawling his chair back over the other side of the room over there. And he said, espionage? And I said, yeah, but espionage, don't worry. Don't worry. I said, and he said, don't worry. And I said, U.S. v. Gorin. U.S. v. Gorin. And he kind of looked at me, and Floyd looked over at me, and Gene was going, U.S. v. Gorin. And I said, yeah, U.S. v. Gorin. I said, U.S. v. Gorin was the case back in 1946 with this young lieutenant in the Navy, Lieutenant J.G., that in fact was at Pearl Harbor, and he had access to the sailing schedules for our troop ships. And he gave the sailing schedule to the Brits, who are our allies, so that they'd know what our sailing schedule was as to where we were deploying our troops, etc. And he was indicted for espionage, a violation of Section 793 of the Espionage Act, for communicating information relating to the national security of the United States to people not authorized to have it. And they all looked like, because they'd never heard of it, and they said, really? And I said, yeah. I said, but the court ruled, in not a very well-known opinion, but they ruled that the term information related to the national defense was so inherently vague on the face of it that in order for the prosecution of any given case to be constitutional, they would have to prove that there was actual scienter, actual evil intent to actually violate the Espionage Act, like people would normally think, that basically they were giving it to the enemy with purposes of hurting the United States. And if they didn't show and prove beyond a reasonable doubt this element of specific intent or scienter, that in fact the statute would be unconstitutionally vague and the prosecution would have to be stopped. And so they all smiled like that and they said, really? And I said, yeah. I said, but of course, that would require them to do the criminal prosecution against you, but you shouldn't worry about it, And he said, but what if they try to get an injunction to stop us? I said, injunction to stop you? That'd be a prior restraint. I said, there's never been a single case of prior restraint in the entire history of the United States. Since the very first day of the courts, there hasn't been a single prior restraint. I said, because that's a violation of the First Amendment. They can't possibly do that. So he said, well, and Floyd is going, no, wait a second. We've got to have some kind of meetings. We've got to talk with our executive committee about this, et cetera. But by this time, Jim Goodell was a happy little clam. And he said, okay, look, we got this figured out. We got U.S. v. Gorin. And he goes back to the editors, and he tells Punch Sulzberger about this and Abe Rosenthal, and he starts laying this thing all out. And a gigantic war starts inside the board of editors of the New York Times. Two different camps start going after each other about whether this is patriotic or whether they're going to be allowed to do this or not. And so, but in the meantime, our office is kind of catatonic, trying to figure out what to do about this, because you got John McKay, you got Larry McKay, who's our senior partner, who's a Knights of Malta guy, which are somewhere to the right of Attila the Hun. He's our senior partner, and we got all these other partners that are thinking this is terribly unpatriotic, blah 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 blah. And of course, then when the Times offered to retain us for $1 million up front, they started thinking a little harder about it. And so we end up. They make the decision on the 11th of June Punch Sulzberger makes the decision that they're going to go ahead and publish these. And so we get word that they're going to publish these. So they start publishing them, and I had recommended they publish them in the Sunday New York Times, because a lot more people read the Sunday New York Times and read the Times every single day. So they had to publish it right on the front page, and so they did. June 13th of 1971, front page, New York Times, bang, there it is. Secret Vietnam papers, and out they come. And the following morning, the second edition came out, additional copies of the papers, starting to reveal things like the fact that the Bay of Tonkin was a complete lie, that it was just a total lie, that and that they all knew that it was a lie, that they made it up, because they actually had discussions going back and forth in cables that were in there about we need something like a Pearl Harbor. We need some kind of thing. We need some kind of actual attack on us. And so that they had sent the USS Henry Knox they had two of the ships that were over there, the USS Maddox and the USS Henry Knox. And I happened to interview guys from both of them, and they confirmed that they were actually shelling the coastline of Vietnam in these ships. And the fact is that nobody attacked them. That what was happening is there were two boats trying to help one of the boats that the USS Maddox had shelled, and it was sinking. And so some other boats came out to try to help them, and that was all that they were doing. And so this is revealed in the first 2 days. And so that was that Monday morning. And so Monday morning, the Nixon administration, Mitchell, sends a cable to our office and to the office of the New York Times, informing them that the United States government opposes any further publication. It was, wow, that was a shocker, you know, and so there was a big decision as to whether they were going to continue to go forward and defy the administration. We'd already had them get ready to know that that was going to happen, so they agreed to defy them. And so Tuesday morning, at about 8 o'clock in the morning, the next morning, this is the third issue of them have come out on the front page of the New York Times. Actually below the next, it was not the top story, it was the second story. The lead story was the fact that the administration had contacted the Times and insisted they stop. That was the lead line. And so I get a call from, I'm in my office, and I get a call, and the secretary hands in the phone, and she says, it's a Whitney North Seymour. And so I pick up the phone, and he goes, hello, Mr. Sheehan? He says, Whitney North Seymour here. And I said, Whitney North Seymour, Whitney North Seymour. I mean, am I supposed to know who you are? He said, I'm the Whitney North Seymour. I am the chief of the Justice Department. I am, in fact, the U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York. And I said, right. That Whitney North Seymour. And he was just beside himself. And he said, look, I'm just calling you up as a courtesy. You know, we're going to go in front of the court this afternoon at 2 o'clock. 2:30 actually, and this is just a courtesy call. You know, I didn't even have to notify you. We could have gone, you know, without you. And I said, oh, ex parte? You're just going to go ex parte to the judge and without us there? He said, well, you know, I thought it was a courtesy to you. I said, well, you know, I appreciate the courtesy, but I take it that you're going to be doing what? Asking for a prior restraint? Is that what you're after, a prior restraint on the New York Times? He said, well, you can call it whatever you want. I said, no, I'm just calling it what it's always been called, is a prior restraint, which is completely prohibited by the First Amendment. And he said, well, you know, I assume that's your position. He said, but we have a different position. And I said, I assume you do. I said, I assume they always have. Kings have always had that position. And he said, you know, I don't need to have this kind of a conversation with you. He says, just if you're going to be there, I just thought you might want to tell Mr. Abrams that we're going to be there. So I said, we're awful busy over here, you know. We got these, we're reviewing a lot of materials right here now. And I don't know whether we're going to have time to go there, but I appreciate the call. So he hangs up on me. So I go tell Floyd, you know, and so we all mount up. And so in Floyd, big mistake here. Floyd decides he wants to go find Alex Bickel. Alex Bickel, who I've mentioned to you before, was the constitutional law professor at Yale who taught Floyd Abrams. And Floyd had brought in Bickle, Professor Bickle, to help us on the balancing questions with regard to in re Pappas and Caldwell. That I was writing all the briefs, taking these firm, rigid positions on behalf of the First Amendment, but I knew there were going to be these other arguments about a balancing test. Floyd said he wanted to go get Bickle because he was an expert at this, and I said, absolutely not. I said, Bickle, everybody knows about Bickle. Bickle can balance away any right you can identify. I said, why do we want him? He said, look, he was my professor. I need to be respectful for him. And, if we're going to do some kind of a balancing test, I think we ought to use him. And so I said, well, I'm a first-year lawyer here. You can do what you want. But he had Bickle in helping us on those amicus briefs. So Floyd reaches out to get Alex Bickle, because he figures, you bring the head of the Con Law Department from Yale Law School with you, to this hearing. And so I go, Floyd Abrams is there, he brings Professor Bickle, and Gene Scheinman. So the four of us, we go over to the federal courthouse, and we find out that it's Murray Gerfein is going to be hearing this case. Murray Gerfein had just been appointed to be a federal judge. And so it turns out this was the very first matter that Murray Gerfein ever heard as a federal judge. He had been a special district attorney in New York. In fact, had been the guy on behalf of Tom Dewey, who back in 1944 had gone into Comstock Prison up at Great Meadows, New York, to negotiate on behalf of Thomas Dewey with Lucky Luciano, to allow him to be freed to go over to Italy to get the mafia people over there to help be scouts for the United States military when they landed at Salerno in September, and in Italy further later, and to get them to infiltrate the major unions, the Longshoremen's Union in the United States, to keep any communist influence from being allowed to develop in the unions, and as it turns out, thirdly, to help smuggle heroin from Southeast Asia through Cuba into the United States to be able to help secretly finance the nationalist Chinese of Chiang Kai-shek against Mao in China, all of which is now shown to have been happening. But that's who Murray Gerfein is. So here's Murray Gerfein, and he calls us into chambers. So we go into chambers, the four of us, and there's Whitney North Seymour, this great big kind of lumbering guy with a big shock of white hair. And he comes in, and Murray Gerfein is sitting there in his chambers, and he says, okay, he said, it's your motion, Mr. Seymour. So what's your position? Whitney North Seymour says, Your Honor, it's our position that we need to have a restraining order issued prohibiting the further publication of these classified documents, because it's our position that there's information contained in these documents which, if publicly revealed, would irrevocably damage the national security of the United States. So I said, oh yeah, like what? And he goes, listen, I'm not at liberty to discuss this. He says, because it's classified. And so I can't, I'm not at liberty to give any details on what will happen. And I said, great. I said, good. Are we all done here? I said, Your Honor, obviously they've got at least a little burden of proof here to go forward and assert what the details are, what kind of damage is supposed to happen here. As an absolute minimum. They're not even going to be willing to try. So I think we're all done here. Okay, so come on, Floyd, let's get going here. So here I'm the first-year lawyer, right? And here's Bickle sitting there, and here's Floyd sitting there, and Gene Scheinman is sitting there going, oh, gee, this is really painful. And so I said, I think we're done. And then Judge Gazelle says to Floyd, he says, Mr. Abrams, he said, I'm assuming that since your client has been publishing these documents, I'm assuming that your law firm, a very respected law firm in our city, has a copy of these documents. And Floyd started to go, and I said, excuse me, Your Honor. I said, you can assume anything you want. I said, but nobody here is admitting that we have copies of these documents. In fact, our client, the New York Times, hasn't even admitted that they've got them. Okay, and he says, well, now look, he said, I know you've got them. And so look at Mr. Abrams, he said, I'm just asking you as a courtesy to the court, would you please voluntarily agree to make a copy of the 47 volumes of these documents that you've got and give a copy to the court so that we can review the content to make a determination as to whether or not we, untutored by Mr. Seymour, can come to the conclusion that there's some information in there that if it's publicly revealed will irrevocably damage the national security of the United States. And I said, excuse me, Your Honor. I said, excuse me. I said, that's not our obligation. And he said, I'm talking to Mr. Abrams. And I said, moreover, I said, even if there were, what is the source of constitutional authority on the basis of which the federal executive branch has the authority to stop us from publishing these? And Murray Gerfine looked kind of shocked like that. And Whitney Norris Seymour said, it's a violation of the Espionage Act, he says. And I said, oh, then you're going to bring criminal charges? And he said, no, we're asking for a restraining order. We're asking for a restraining order. And I said, well, you're asking for a restraining order, but you haven't put forth any proof whatsoever of what your allegations are. These are just bald-faced allegations that you're making here. And at which point, Murray Gerfine said, Mr. Abrams, I want to repeat, would you please, as a matter of courtesy, agree to copy the 47 volumes that your office has and give a copy to the court? And if Mr. Seymour doesn't have any interest in trying to explain to us what the particulars are, what he thinks is going to cause the national security damage, then we may not be able to find anything there, but would you please let us do that? And Floyd agreed to do it. I mean, one of the all-time colossal legal mistakes, that were sitting there I was just flabbergasted that he agreed to do that. So he says, thank you. He says, what we'll do is that we'll have a full hearing on this. You get the documents to me. And this was Tuesday. He said, and we'll reconvene at 10 o'clock on Friday morning, and I'll give you my ruling. And so we got ready, and he said, in the meantime, would the Times please volunteer, just voluntarily, to agree to stop publishing these until we can get a ruling on this on Friday? And I said, absolutely not. And I said, no, absolutely not. We're not going to do that. And then Bickle gets up and says, no, we would decline to do that respectfully. And so the judge says, well, in that case, then I'm going to enter the temporary restraining order. First time ever in the entire history of the United States, and the only time, actually, that they actually prohibited the publication of information. Now, the reason why it's so shocking is because, if there's anything that the First Amendment provides for, it's that. And there's all kinds of discussions about that in the debates and everything else. And so, I was just kind of flabbergasted that he had done it. But he did. And so we leave, and we went back to the office, and I was starting to argue that what we had to do was go immediately to the Circuit Court of Appeals, the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, and ask for an order vacating the restraining order. That it was only Tuesday afternoon. We could get it ruled on before Friday, but they wouldn't do it. What they said is, look, they've imposed the restraining order. We've got the legal precedent of them having done it. And I said, but look, you've got to maintain the kind of emergency air about this. For you to lay back and not go to the Court of Appeals and immediately insist that they remove this prior restraint is kind of acquiescing in some sense to the prior restraint. He said, no, he said that we need time to prepare for this. We're going to prepare for it and get to the hearing. And I said, well, what are the legal positions you're going to argue in the hearing? Other than the fact that the temporary restraining order is illegitimate and it's a violation of the First Amendment. He said, well, we're going to do that. So we started working at drafting up the oppositions to this, and they presented them on Friday, but we come into the chambers on Friday, and Murray Gerfine announces, he says, look, left completely untutored by Mr. Seymour or his staff as to what particular content he's talking about in here, myself and my, it was really interesting, because he had said when we were there before, he said, Mr. Seymour, he said, look, would you agree to at least confidentially communicate to the court what the particulars are, what you think is going to irrevocably damage the national security of the United States. And he says, I'm sorry, Your Honor, I can't. You don't have the proper clearances either. I said, great. So he hadn't given the judge anything. And so on Friday morning, Judge Gerfine enters his order saying, look, we've been unable to find anything that we can clearly determine would irrevocably damage the national security of the United States. And Mr. Seymour has been of no assistance to us in doing this. So I'm ruling that, in fact, we're lifting the stay, we're lifting the temporary restraining order, and the Times is free to publish. And so they said, oh, terrific, let's go. And we all started to leave. And Seymour says, no, wait a second. We're going up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals right now, and we're going to ask them to reinstate the restraining order. And so I go with him. And Gene Shyman went with me, and Floyd came, but Bickle didn't. And they go upstairs in the federal courthouse up to the Second Circuit Court of Appeals office up there, and they have a motion session. And so they went in, and Irving Kaufman, a justice on the Second Circuit Court of Appeals, is there on the motion session. They go into him and they make their motion to reinstate the restraining order against the Times. And Irving Kaufman, you'll never forget this, Irving Kaufman's sitting there behind his desk and rocking back and forth like this, and he's saying, gentlemen, he said, 25 years ago to the day, 25 years ago to the day, I was asked to enter a temporary restraining order to stop a particular event taking place. And I've often thought about it in the last 25 years, my refusal to grant that, whether that was a mistake or not. So I don't want to make that same error twice. He said, so I'm going to give them this restraining order. He was talking about the Rosenberg case. He is the judge who refused to enter a stay stopping the execution of Ethel Rosenberg and her husband, who were charged with giving nuclear secrets to the Soviet Union. And the Rosenberg case is this big, famous case from back in 1945. It's a super controversial case to this day about whether or not there was actual legitimate evidence on the basis of which to convict them. But anyway, so he reinstates the stay, and so that was that Tuesday afternoon. So they set the hearing for the following 3 days later because of the emergency nature of this. So they skipped the 3-judge panel, and we ended up going right in front of all 13 justices of the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Almost never do they ever get together. It was a pretty august operation. We go in, and of course we didn't sleep for the 3 days because we were briefing this thing like mad. So we were now in, we're in like 6 days of this thing. And we're there in the Second Circuit Court of Appeals. Judge Friendly was there, the whole operation. They had all their clerks there, and clerks from other federal judges from all around the United States and the Circuit Courts of Appeals all filled the courtroom. So we've got this big, gigantic courtroom. It's like about maybe, 10 times the size of this. And it was just hanging off the rafters. And everybody that was in there were the federal judges or us, we lawyers, the 4 of us, and all the clerks, all the law clerks. So I saw half of my class from Harvard Law School. We're all sitting there, watching us do this case. And poor Gene Shyman kept falling asleep. It was so, everybody was exhausted from doing this thing, right? And so we make the argument, and the following morning, they ruled that they wanted the stay to stay in place, but they wanted to remand the case back to Murray Gerfine to give a more detailed analysis of, to find out, spend more time looking into the documents and give the government a chance to make an argument. They signaled very clearly that the government ought to come forward and make some specific assertions as to what specific damage based on what specific information, but they hadn't done it yet. And so they were basically trying to give them a chance to cure the record that they had. And so we went back to the office and said, look, don't let them do this. Don't sit around. I wanted you to go up to the Second Circuit before, but now you got to go to the Supreme Court right away. You've got to petition immediately to go to the Supreme Court, catch them with their pants down like this, that they've made no arguments whatsoever. So let's go. And so they did. They filed a petition for the issuance of writ of certiorari. The court granted it. They went looking for the judges because by this time now we're into the like 17th, 18th of June. And so they had to go get Justice Douglas, who was climbing in the mountains, in the Rocky Mountains. They had to send a search party of U.S. Marshals to go find him because he didn't have any phone, he didn't have anything. And they had to go drag him out of there, and they had to get all the judges, back in. And we come to the United States Supreme Court. We got the briefs to the justices 2 hours before the oral argument, and got the thing that we went into the Supreme Court. And now I'm down there. There's Floyd and myself and Gene Scheinman and one of the senior partners who had nothing to do with the case. And the question came up as to whether Bickle was going to be allowed into the courtroom, because I kept saying he shouldn't be allowed in because he's going to agree to a balancing test here. And one of the judges is going to say to him, what about the troop ships? What if the New York Times wanted to publish on the front page the sailing schedule of the troop ships? I just said to him, that's U.S. v. Gorin. They already had that case, and they already found the guy that he wasn't guilty, unless you can prove scienter. And unless they can allege scienter here of an evil intent to give the information specifically to the enemy to hurt the United States, they can't win this thing. And so we were in the hotel room, and Floyd came to me, and he said, look, you're going to have to tell him. I can't tell him. He's my professor. You got to tell him that either he's going to have to agree not to give up on the troop ship analogy, or he's not going to be allowed to come into the courtroom. So I go back into the other room. I sit down. I walk in there, and there's Professor Bickle, and I said, look, Professor Bickle, I said, look I got to make something clear to you here. I said, look you aren't coming in. You aren't coming into this courtroom. He said, what? I said, you're not coming into the courtroom. I said, you come into the courtroom, and this was different. See, I wasn't asking him, here's a condition on which you can come into the courtroom. I was just telling him he wasn't coming into the courtroom. And he said, I'm not coming to the courtroom. I said, because you'll give away the troop ship analogy. I said, you'll give it away. I don't want to hear an argument from you because I know you'll do it. And he said, well, wait a second. He says, that was in Near versus Minnesota. They specifically mentioned that. I said, that was before U.S. v. Gorin. U.S. v. Gorin, he says. U.S. v. Gorin. I said, yes, before U.S. v. Gorin. And he said, well, I think that it would be unpatriotic to publish a thing with a troop ship like that. I said, that's why you're not going. That's why you're not going in there. And he said, I'm not going in there. Why? And I said, because you are a fucking traitor to the Constitution of the United States. And I will not have you in the courtroom. And he was just kind of aghast like that. And so he kind of wandered off. And so we go into the courtroom, and Floyd apparently, was feeling completely abashed by the whole thing. So he agreed to allow him to come and sit there, but he couldn't say anything. So he sat him down. And I was afraid if you even let him in the courtroom, Harlan or somebody was going to say, Professor Bickle, what about the troop ship analogy? But he didn't. So anyway, we go in and we do the oral argument, and you got to read what it is that happened there. We had this extraordinary thing where there were 10 written opinions. There is the per curiam, which usually is a kind of thing that is handed down in a case that is an easy case. A case in which there's not a whole lot of discussion of the facts or the details of the law or anything else. Those are those little per curiam opinions that the court issues. So they issued a per curiam. As you saw it, they said basically, any request to have a prior restraint comes to this court with a very heavy burden. Yeah, how about never? How about they've never had one ever? So I mean, what's this crap about with a very heavy burden? There's no burden at all. You can't do it. So he says, well, it comes here with a very heavy burden, and what we all agree upon is that whatever this burden may be, the federal government surely hasn't met the burden. Mainly because they never said anything. They wouldn't say what it was. And so we had trapped them because we'd gone up and never given them a chance to get back down into the district court in front of Gazelle or Murray Gurfein. And so we trapped them, and so they were caught on the record having said nothing about it, and clearly they had failed to meet their burden. So they all agreed to it. Now this is quite an array here of personages that are on the bench at that particular time. You had Hugo Black, you had Justice Douglas, You had John Harlan. I won't tell you the story about John Harlan unless you make me. And William Brennan and Thurgood Marshall and Byron Whizzer White and Harry Blackman, they were all there. And the defendants that were named by Whitney Norris Seymour included, Punch Sulzberger, one of the great famous names in journalism, the publisher of the New York Times, Jim Goodell himself, just to make Jim Goodell feel good, they named him, Scotty Reston, James Reston, Tom Wicker, Neil Sheehan himself, Hendrick Smith, Fox Butterfield. I mean, these are some of the biggest names in the history of American journalism. They were all named as defendants by Whitney Norris Seymour. And here's the judges, just these renowned judges that are all here on this case. And they split in this weird, bizarre way that they have 9, each one of the 9 justices wrote his own opinion about this. And then they all joined in this per curiam. And it remains today one of the most absolutely extraordinary experiences in judicial history of how fast this thing rocketed from their first effort to stop it all the way to the Supreme Court pulling guys out of the woods and off vacation to do this thing in the middle of the summer. And you get this extraordinary division of the opinions. And when you do these little charts of these guys, and so here you have the per curiam opinion, right? Then you get the 2 opinions of Justice Black and Justice Douglas, just flaming out in favor of the First Amendment. Basically saying, who do you think you are, Seymour, trying to get a prior restraint here. Then you got the logical suspects on the other side of this thing. You got Harlan, you got Whizzer White, and you got, of course, Berger. The 3 of them dissenting, just saying absolutely frightening things, which we'll talk about a little bit here before we close. And then you got the guys in the middle. Then you got the 4 guys in the middle. Here you got let's see here. You got Marshall, who is just a little bit to the right of where Black and Douglas was. Then you got Brennan, who's a little bit further to the right of him. Then you got Potter Stewart, the all-important 5th vote on this case, supported by Whizzer White, and then Whizzer White writing his own opinion. So that gives you the 6 guys. But what you need to look for in a case like this is you need to look for the all-important 5th vote. Because the four guys, Douglas and Black and Marshall and Brennan, are important decisions, but it's Potter Stewart that you need to look at in this particular opinion to figure out what's really determining the decision in that case. And so I'll ask you, who is it that knows what Potter Stewart said that turns out to be the ultimate deciding vote in this case? I won't do that to you. It's like law school. That's where they always go, Miss Jones, like that. And she goes, ah! But anyway, what he said, very uncomfortable, is he said there was a dilemma, that you had a dilemma here, where you had this very strong historical rule against a prior restraint. But you have this overwhelmingly important interest of the United States government to preserve itself from total absolute destruction. Of course, now whenever you see the balance get struck that way, you get a pretty good idea where this is going, right? And he says that it's clear to me, catch this, it's clear to me that it is the constitutional duty of the executive as a matter of sovereign prerogative, not as a matter of law, to make the decision as to what steps need to be taken to protect classified information in the national security. Now, if you want to see a scary principle, there it is, right there. The Stewart, while he agrees that in this particular instance they couldn't meet the burden, that there's a strong presumption operating on behalf of the executive. But what he says is that he said the government, in order to get a prior restraint, acknowledging that they have a right to get a prior restraint, would have to show that, he said, we cannot say in this case that the disclosure of any of this material, listen to this now, will surely result in direct, immediate, and irreparable damage to the national security of the United States. So there's the standard that he sets. But while it's a high standard, the difficulty is that he assumes that they have the right to get the prior restraint. But if you back up a bit and look at Brennan's opinion, which is a more favorable opinion, what he says is, look, he says the same thing. Okay. He said that we'll acknowledge that there may be some conceivable circumstance under which the executive branch could come and get an injunction like this. But what he says is that it's, for example, in the modern age with nuclear weapons, it's like 24. It's like Kiefer Sutherland, you know? It's like, oh, they're going to blow up New York again, you know, with a nuclear device again. You know, and so that what he says basically is, look, he seems to suggest that if in fact there's an immediate threat of a nuclear explosion, that in that kind of an instance you may be able to get a prior restraint. But what he's ignoring is the better argument that was made, since I wrote it, in this particular case, is that, look, what are you talking about here? What are you talking about? How can the executive branch come into a court and invoke the support of the judicial branch to issue a prior restraint when Congress, which is the government of the United States, is completely prohibited from passing a statute that authorizes them to do that? And the reason they can't do it is because of the First Amendment, that no law shall be made by Congress limiting the freedom of the press. And that's why there's no such statute, okay? And so but it was really interesting, the hero of this whole case, who, but for my telling you about him, you would never know, is a young fellow named Michael Tierney. Michael Tierney was a lawyer in our office at Cahill who dug through the dusty dungeons of the legislative history of all these things, and he discovered that when Section 793 of the Espionage Act was being drafted, there was an actual proposal made on the floor to specifically give the authority to the executive branch to stop the publication of information that would be damaging to the national security of the United States. And in fact, in the face of the argument that it would violate the First Amendment of the United States Constitution, it was withdrawn. And Mike Tierney found that. Came running into the office and said, look what I got here. And you'll see that 4 of the justices cited that. They kept saying, look, we don't have a situation here where Congress hasn't spoken on this. The fact is that this was proposed and Congress specifically refused to do it. And so therefore, what we're looking at here is the executive branch coming into the judicial branch asking us to make the law when Congress has specifically refused to do it. And that's where 4 of the justices came down. And so Mike Tierney is the guy who basically saved the day. That he got 4 of those justices, Whizzer White, Stewart, Brennan, and Marshall, to all come on and say, look, no matter what else flowery language they all said, whether it's supportive of the First Amendment or supportive of the power of the state, they all said, look, in this instance, when the government of the United States itself, the Congress, has refused to do this specifically, you can't come in here asking us to do it. Okay? And so what that means is that if you take those 4 justices and you put them together with Black and Douglas, you've got a situation here that where until such time as Congress passes such a statute, which could be challenged as a violation of the First Amendment, they aren't going to be able to get these kind of injunctions. Okay? But there's a far more important issue here, and that is this. There's a case, the one that I cited to them in our briefs, is called Youngstown Sheet and Tube. It's a very important case, even though it's got a bizarre name. The Youngstown Sheet and Tube is a case that came back in 1954 during the Korean War. And what happened is that the union, the steelworkers, United Steelworkers, struck against the steel mills. And President Truman, citing the fact that the Korean War was going on and that it was a matter of national security to keep the steel mills open, mobilized the United States military and sent them into the steel mills to try to reopen the steel mills, to make them run. And so the Union people brought a federal action against him to get an injunction stopping him from doing it. And in that case, an extraordinarily important case, the court ruled that, look, there's a really fundamental thing you need to understand here. And that is that the executive branch, even joined with the judicial branch, ain't the government of the United States. The government of the United States is the Congress, that is the representative body, and they are the government of the United States. So whoever it is that has the authority, whether it's challengeable as unconstitutional or not, but whoever has the presumptive authority, it has to be Congress. And so therefore, since Congress had not passed any statute, particularly explicitly forbidding this, you couldn't come in and get this injunction. And it's a most powerful argument that could be made. The real challenge comes is what happens. There's two challenges. One is if Congress does pass such a statute and you go in to stop them, what's going to happen when you lose this part of the argument? You don't have this argument to make. And so I want to close and open for questions with one final issue here. And that is, you'll notice in the decision, you'll notice one reference made to Hirabayashi. And this is this question about the inherent authority of the executive branch. Because in the teeth of this argument that the executive branch ain't the government of the United States, that it's the Congress, and if Congress has specifically looked at an issue and refused to do anything about it, you can't come in and ask the judiciary branch to support the executive in doing it. But you look at it in a slightly different way here. And in Hirabayashi, what happened is that the day after December 7th of 1941, in the bombing of Pearl Harbor, President Roosevelt issued an executive order, a presidential executive order 1066. And in that order, he said that the United States is hereby divided into 10 military districts. And in each military district, the commanding general of the United States Army shall have the authority to issue in writing prohibitions prohibiting citizens of the United States from engaging in specific conducts. And if any citizen violates those edicts, that person can be tried in front of a military tribunal and sentenced to incarceration in a military stockade. Okay? Now, pursuant to that executive order, the commanding general of the 1st Military District in California in the West Coast issued an order prohibiting all persons of Asian ancestry from being allowed to be out in public after 7 p.m. And this young fellow, by the name of Hirabayashi, down in San Diego, who's like a third-generation American, is out in the front yard doing a barbecue with his friends, and the military police come rolling by. And they see him out there, and they say, "Looks like an Asian to me." And they go rushing over, and they snatch him up and arrest him, bring him in front of a military tribunal, and convict him for violating the rule. He freaks out and says, "What are you doing? This is crazy. You know, I'm a civilian. You can't do this to me." And he files a petition for the issuance of a writ of habeas corpus that I mentioned to you. They have the body, bring him in front of the court, and find out whether there's any probable cause, constitutional cause to hold him. And he petitions for the issuance of a writ of habeas corpus to the federal district court. The district court denies it and says that this is a matter for the military and that he has to appeal to the military court of appeals. So he files an appeal to the military court of appeals, and of course they sustain it. And they throw him in the jug, and they keep him in the military stockade. And he then petitions to the Court of Military Appeals, top military appeals, and then petitions to the United States Supreme Court. The United States Supreme Court, having a petition from the Military Court of Appeals, is not a petition for the issuance of a writ of certiorari. It's not a discretionary writ. It's a mandatory writ that they have to review that. And they sit there from 1945 to 1946, or excuse me, from 1941 to 42 to 43 to 44, all the way to after Japan is surrendered. And on the day after Japan surrenders, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court calls his clerk in, whom I've discussed this matter with. He calls him in and he says, he says, we've had this Hirabayashi case hanging around here for 4 years now. And he makes this really interesting argument here that, because Congress had passed no statute authorizing the president to issue any kind of an executive decree of this kind, that the president has, in the executive branch, has no inherent authority to do that. And so this is a very troubling question that's here. And so I've got two envelopes here for you, and I'd like to give them to you and have you bring them over to the Speaker of the House and to the Majority Leader in the Senate. And so the clerk says, all right, and he runs over and he delivers one to the Speaker of the House and one to the Majority Leader in the Senate. And that afternoon, each House of Congress passed a statute saying, in the event of a direct attack upon the physical territory of the United States government by a foreign power, the President of the United States shall hereby be authorized to issue an order as follows. And they attached Executive Order 1066 to it. And so the very next day, the court sends notice to the lawyers for Hirabayashi that they will hear his oral argument on the following Monday. And they come before the court on the following Monday, and the Chief Justice says, Mr. Hirabayashi's attorneys, you make a very interesting point here about how if there were no statute passed by Congress, this question of whether or not the executive branch would have the inherent authority to issue such an executive order. That's a very important and very troubling question here. Fortunately, we don't have to confront it in this case because there happens to be a statute that is passed here for this. Now, you may argue that it's an ex post facto law, but I don't see that anywhere in your briefs that have been here for like 3 years. So what I'm going to do is we're going to remand it back down to the district court for further hearings. But we're going to save this question for another time. And that is the question saved in Hirabayashi, which is the underlying question that permeated this case of the Pentagon Papers case. Does the executive branch have some kind of inherent authority that is not given to them by Congress anywhere to stop the presses if they think that it's going to destroy the national security? And what if, and so you got the two questions. What if Congress were to pass a statute giving them the authority? And what happens when, for example, there's a potential nuclear explosion? When, Kiefer Sutherland would torture somebody. If Kiefer Sutherland will torture them, then the court will give a prior restraint on people publishing the information. So that's the case, and so that it's a lot of important issues, and I, again, apologize for going the full time on this, but this is probably one of the most important cases that you're ever going to come into contact with, so I just wanted to make sure you knew all the information about it. And so before my TAs get up and authorize you to leave, I just want to, if there's any questions that you've got about this, I'd be happy to answer them.
2 questions maybe? Anybody have one?
Yeah, I got a question.
Yeah.
So in the last class, you mentioned a guy named John Yu, who's a professor at Berkeley, and he recently has been arguing a lot about this. He made it legal to detain people for the Bush administration. And his argument was that the United States executive branch has its own right to interpret the Constitution for itself, as with the legislative. What's your opinion on, I can guess what your opinion would be. What would the logical following be against that opinion?
Well, what it is it's very clear that the executive branch has, ever since Marbury versus Madison, it's been made absolutely clear that the judiciary has the authority to determine whether or not the executive branch does or does not have the authority to engage in a particular activity, and that they are superior, and that they can invoke U.S. Marshals or anybody else to enforce their rulings. And so that's clear. This is Marbury versus Madison. What these guys, John Yoo and David Addington and the other people, primarily all kind of covened around Dick Cheney, were asserting that, we're a co-equal branch. We can interpret the Constitution. That what they're basically trying to do is say, it's their Marbury versus Madison. Oh, if you say you can interpret the Constitution, we say we can interpret the Constitution. That would mean that, well, so can the legislative branch. And if they decide that they just want to, well, for example, say everybody has to be a Catholic in the United States, that they can do that. And if the court says you can't do that, then let them go get soldiers, according to Andrew Jackson. Let them go get their own soldiers to enforce that. So that it cannot be allowed to stand. It's just like Oliver North said to me when I was doing his deposition. Oliver North said, Dan, I know you and I have a disagreement about this. He said, but, the Congress has the power of the purse strings and is authorized to appropriate money to engage in military action, and therefore they have the power to declare war or not. He said, but we in the executive branch, as long as we can get the money from somewhere else, we can do anything we want to do. And so that they thought that getting the money from the Prince of Brunei authorized them to make war on the country of Nicaragua, and that the legislature had no authority to stop them. So that there's a whole strain of that that goes on with John Yoo and Addington and North and the rest of those fascists. That it's just simple fascism. They just think that, well, hey, fascism isn't that bad. Fascism gets kind of a bad rap, they think. Okay with not asking another question? No. Just look at there was maybe a couple more that people have. Yes. Yeah.
So you showed some knowledge of the inner workings of the Kennedy administration during a history of the Vietnam War, and then you also explained their new policies. So do you personally theorize that the new policies the Kennedy brothers adopted as of late 1962 regarding nuclear disarmament, withdrawing troops from Vietnam, and forming relations with the government of Cuba, and the following conflicts with the CIA, were part of the ultimate cause of one or both of their assassinations?
I'm glad you asked. That's next week. That's the discussion for next week. Try to get the rest of the kids to come. Okay?